everyone to the third session in our spring series of three on the Golden Triangle, exploring the current and the future world of work and the workplace. My name is Tim Allen, and I'm the Managing Director of Workplace for Abberley, and delighted to be hosting this session. Firstly, a little bit of housekeeping. Please be aware that we are recording this session, so if you prefer, please do turn off your video function at this point. Also, a reminder, please to keep on mute through the session, as this keeps the background noise distractions just to a minimum, which helps with the panel, and particularly me, with a short attention span on some of this. So that just is inordinately helpful. So thank you for that as well. However, we really do want your input and thoughts. So please do make the most of the chat function through the session to comment and ask questions, as there will be Q&A at the end. So I think that's it on our housekeeping. So over to onto our introductions, and just in case there may be somebody who's not come across Abberley before, a quick introduction on us. We're independent workplace consultants, and by that we mean that we're focused on the right outcome for clients with no ulterior motive on design projects or transaction fees. And amongst the team, we have decades of collective experience planning and delivering successful workplace strategy and change programs for clients throughout UK, Europe, and the US. And this afternoon, we are rejoined by our amazing guest panel. They were also with us at the end of last year for our first session. Please do check that out on Abberley iPlayer, otherwise known as our website. Just have a little look at that previous one. The team is here again to look through the, hopefully clearing now, mists of the crystal ball to explore the real estate sector in a little bit more detail. In our previous Golden Triangle session, which was about 6 weeks or so ago, we were joined by the team at OECAM to discuss and explore the HR angle of hybrid working. And today we'll be picking up on that aspect again, but more specifically from the real estate point of view, and hence the real estate aspect. So, oh, that's the housekeeping part. Of course, I've just realized that I'm the one who's also driving, so that's the reason why I was behind on my slides there. There we go. A positive abundance of experience in the field of real estate is fulfilled by our guests. The pictures on the screen now. So we have Richard Pepperell and Lee Williamson from Spring 4, independent real estate consultants and project managers, and Ramatu Banga and Faye Highland from Field Fisher at the European law firm. Last time I provided a pretty much full red book history of the team, but this time perhaps we'll go for a somewhat more summarized Wikipedia version. So just very briefly, Ramatu has over 25 years of experience in commercial real estate. Faye has been in the real estate litigation team at Field Fisher for over 10 years. Richard began his real estate career in 1991. I don't know why Richard's the only one I draw out on that one. Apologies. Before starting Spring 4 in 2001, Lee has been a director of Spring 4 since 2015. As ever, please feel free to look people up on their LinkedIn profiles. So that is our team of experts. And why are we particularly looking at the Golden Triangle right now? That's the sort of this physical, virtual, human, or more specifically for us on this talk, sort of property, technology, and people. As we've been mentioning throughout the series on this, that this is a moment in recent history like no other. And at Abberley, we certainly believe that this is a good time for organizations to start preparing for the new world of work. So its arrival has been accelerated, and we've all experienced working away from the office and away from colleagues using technology, all to a degree we may not have imagined. And in turn, this has shifted perhaps our hopes and expectations on future commuting, office presence, location, autonomy, overall personal choice, creating somewhat of a misalignment between people and place. So when we consider what all of this means for work and the workplace, we really do have to explore the wider perspective about people, culture, community, sustainability, technology, travel, the work environment, be it home, office, hybrid, and of course, the real estate, as all the interconnections that truly underpin how we and organizations perform. So this is the true nature of work and the workplace. So a quick view on the contents for today's session. Short introduction, yet further introduction from me, but we will keep it brief. And then it's looking really at having a market update from Spring 4, then a legal update from Field Fisher. We'll then be moving on to a panel discussion before then finally surrounding ourselves in Q&A. So please do keep those questions coming through. So just a quick couple of slides really on the hybrid conversation, and again, just find it really interesting on the elements that are coming through this, that it's we can see here just a few snapshots from what's come through on the internet with it, and a lot of organizations talking through around hybrid. We've got even a number of our clients on here, so we're always pleased to be able to reference what some of our clients are saying. The one in the bottom left-hand corner, particularly picking up on the one from BBC Today. So no full-time return to the office for over 1 million people, one of the latest bits of research. I think what this goes to show is that the conversations around hybrid working, where we're at, really is the topic du jour, and one area that we're going to be discussing in a little bit more detail as we go through our session today. So we're going to whiz over our poll because we're now not able to run that small technical glitch that's going through. Apologies for that, but there we are. Just shows you that it is live. Those of you watching on catch up, apologies. So now we'll have a little look through at getting our panel involved, but we just want to start off with saying, look, from our perspective on the hybrid working, we can begin to see a bit of a timeline that's being set through our conversations with clients, and you're seeing that here with the sort of the graphic in hand, which is a sense that over the next few months we have an opportunity to engage with teams and plan how that return to the office might be looking. And then really the remainder of the year is working on what does that start to pan out to be. So the reason why we were showing all those clips from websites is simply to say there's been a lot of discussion around it, and a lot of people begin to profess that they know what the answer is. I don't think any of us really know what the answer is. It's looking into the future, so that's going to be tricky. So a sense of let's just test that out, and therefore understand that the rest of the year is very much around that view of engaging with teams and with staff. Excuse me. So that we can understand a bit more about that in detail, and then explore how that evolves through 2022. But we'll be chatting about this in a bit more detail through today's session. So to start the discussion on our session today, we're going to be handing over to Lee. So Lee, you can get yourself ready at this point, who's going to provide us with an update on the current market with some useful thoughts. So Lee, over to you.
Thanks, Tim. So so Spring 4, we are tenant representation specialists, and our sort of predominant interest and specialism is within the office sector. So that's really where I'm going to be focusing this presentation on. So if we go to the first slide, Tim. For those of you that weren't able to join the last webinar in November, or just to provide a bit of context, it's quite useful just to give a bit of background to the UK office market to make sense of what's happening today and going forwards. So the way that we like to think of the UK office market, there's probably 3 tiers that we like to think of it in. You've basically got London, which is the major office markets in the UK. It's well over 400 million square feet in size, which is huge, one of the biggest markets in the world. And if you look at UK office asset value, it accounts for nearly or just over 70% of all UK office asset values. So it really is a sort of big hub of office occupiers for the country. Outside of London, we've got what we call tier 2 cities, and that would usually be the large metro areas. So that would include places like Manchester, Glasgow, Birmingham, and other big cities. And then outside of that, you essentially have tier 3 cities, which is everything else. And when we look at the UK office market, what we can tend to see is that, with big economic changes, there are some general trends that you see move with all of the different tiers. There are obviously exceptions to that, and they will be scattered around the country. So if you look at Cambridge as an example, that's behaved quite differently over the last 5 years just because of the huge demand for biotech space there. So there are always exceptions, but generally speaking, the UK office market tends to move broadly together. So if we think about what's happened historically, again, to just create a little bit of context to the current conversation, if we start in 2008, that was obviously the time of a major recession in the UK. One of the initial results of that were that office demand had fallen, rents were also falling, and we saw rents really bottoming out in sort of mid-2010. Since 2010, the office markets across the country were largely recovering. We saw rental values slowly increasing, Tenant demand was increasing, and it was sort of moving away slowly from a tenant's market to a landlord's market. Now, we would think that the office market sort of peaked right before the Brexit referendum votes in the middle of 2016. That happened, and one of the results of that was that it caused a little bit of uncertainty in most markets. So what we saw after that is that most of the rental growth that we've been seeing sort of plateaued in most places and sort of stayed even. Some other things like lease flexibility, so when tenants are signing up to leases, they're able to obtain a bit more flexibility, so landlords are giving away shorter leases than they might have historically. And also, when you're a tenant signing up to a lease in the UK, you would expect to get a rent-free period. Those were sort of increasing after the Brexit referendum votes. And then about 12 months after that, all of those different variables also started stabilizing. Now, what we saw going into 2020, so the back end of 2019, I think landlords were starting to get a bit more optimistic. It looked like we might be finally getting out of Brexit. And there were some early signs that rents might start increasing again. But before any of that could happen, COVID happened. And that obviously changed things quite quickly. So what we saw was that there were two initial reactions by occupiers at the onset of COVID. So if you were an occupier that had an early stage requirement, so let's say you had a lease expiring in a couple of years' time, you thought you were getting a little bit big and you needed more space, most of those requirements just went on standby just because of the uncertainty of what was happening in the world. If you were a tenant that had a requirement that was a little bit more developed, so you might have been agreeing a deal somewhere and having it documented, we found that many of those tenants also aborted their deals and put their requirements on standby. But some did actually proceed and go forwards, but on more flexible terms usually, just to sort of react to the uncertainty of what was happening. So the net result is that for most of 2020, transaction levels completely plummeted across the country. Many tenants were uncertain as to what they wanted to do, so decision-making was on hold. And for that reason, things sort of became quite quiet. In terms of what happened with terms that you could achieve as a tenant, we found that similar to after the Brexit referendum votes, you were able to achieve more rent-free on deals. You could easily get more flexibility in your lease terms. But interestingly, rental levels, particularly for newer buildings, really didn't actually dip. And they were actually stabilized, and landlords were quite optimistic that once COVID was over, that there would be some pent-up demand and they could sort of weather the storm. So that gives you a bit of an idea of what has happened. And if we go to the next slide, Tim, I'll talk about what's happened over the last couple of months since we've gone into the new year. So with this image, it was an interesting one. I initially had an image of a cresting wave that was going to be a sort of image representing maybe a changing tide. Richard thought that was a little bit too optimistic. So we've now gone for this pond with a small ripple in it. So what have we seen over the last couple of months? Well, we've seen the activity is coming back. Spring 4 has lots of clients who maybe were having trouble making decisions over the last year who are now ready to start making decisions, think about making decisions. We've got lots of international clients who had requirements to open up offices in the UK, which were shelved last year, have now come back, and we're out looking at spaces with them. And this is something that we're seeing across our sector, which is positive. But I suppose there is a word of caution. It's not completely at historic average levels. We're disposing, Richard and I are helping to sublet some space for a client in the City of London. We have a joint agent who happens to be one of the biggest agencies in the country. And overall, their viewing levels are at about 50% of the historic average. So it's better than it was at the end of last year and through Christmas and the early parts of 2021. But there's still a long way to go. So Tim, if we can go to the next slide, please. So the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is what we're seeing, is this concept of a two-tier market. And this really applies to central London and most metro areas. And what I mean by this is that one of the things that we've seen through COVID in 2020 and the early parts of this year, and it basically goes in line with the slide that Tim had brought up earlier, is that many companies have been forced to work differently, and their staff are working differently. So people have been forced to work from home. The concept of flexible working is one that has existed for a long time, although not necessarily all companies were hugely receptive of it. And what we think is that COVID has really accelerated that process and really made it clear that for many businesses and sectors, flexible working or ways of working is very viable. So as a result of that, one thing that we think will happen, and we're already seeing it, is a two-tier market where you essentially see what we call a flight to quality. So companies that may be thinking about reducing their space in offices for a variety of reasons would also possibly be interested in having better space. So it's about consolidating into smaller space, but higher quality space. And what that means is that when you look at a picture like this, you see lots of new shiny tower buildings in the City of London. We think that buildings like that, or buildings of a really high specification, will continue to be in high demand by tenants. We don't think that will change. And we don't think that rents are going to be hugely impacted on those buildings. We've not seen evidence to suggest otherwise so far. Where things could be a little bit more difficult for certain landlords is when you're looking at buildings that aren't shiny, new, or of a high specification, so what we call grade B buildings. If we look at the pre-let market, which is an interesting statistic, and it's a question I get asked a lot by clients, they see all these big shiny buildings being built in London and they're asking me all the time, who's letting them? They must be empty. Well, actually, they're not. Of 6 million square feet of offices that are currently under construction in London, of 6 million square feet under construction in the City of London only, just over 30% of that is pre-let. And if you look at the whole of central London, it's actually over 50%. So there are tenants who are acquiring space in these buildings before they're completed. And if you're a tenant with a large requirement, you need to be very active in the market years in advance of your lease event if you want to be sure that you can secure the right space. The other thing that sort of exacerbated this two-tier market is over the last year as well, what we've seen is that there's been a large number of tenants trying to dispose of surplus space, or trying to sublet it, assign it, or surrender it. And that number is now up to, well, at the end of 2020, there was 9 million square feet of tenant release space being marketed in central London. And the vast majority of that was actually based in the City of London, just naturally because the buildings are bigger, there are bigger occupiers. And that doesn't include Canary Wharf, where the number there is also quite significant. In terms of lease terms, if you're a tenant out in the market trying to acquire space, if you're looking at shiny new buildings, it hasn't really changed. If you're looking at tenant space, older spec buildings, there could be some very good opportunities there, because I think landlords and those tenants with that surplus space could be struggling to dispose of it. So if we go to the next slide, Tim. So this is sort of linked to it. It's a statistic that we use called net absorption rates. And the concept behind it is what this graph essentially shows is if you're a tenant in London and you're moving space for whatever reason, so let's say your lease is expired and you're a 50,000 square foot tenant, if you were relocating into a new office that was 60,000 square foot, then you would have a positive 10,000 square foot contribution to the London net absorption rates. And what we can see here is that historically, most quarters, and I think if you look at the totals for any individual year since 2011 on this graph, net absorption rates have always overall been positive. So tenants are leaving space but going into more space. So that's creating a demand for more space in London. Now, what we've seen that's quite interesting since COVID came to the UK is that if you look at 2020, from Q1 onwards, we've now had 5 consecutive quarters of negative net absorption. So tenants are leaving more space than they're going into. This was from CoStar. They're quite optimistic that it's suddenly going to go positive and be sustained positive, but Richard and I aren't so sure about that. We think that because of all the things that we've said before and the sort of changing nature of working practices, we think that net absorption rates may not be as buoyant as they have been historically going forwards. If we just go to the next slide, Tim, I think it's a slide where Richard was going to make a few interesting points about ESG.
Thank you, Lee. So I wanted to just sort of share our perspective on ESG and how we see that changing. what we've experienced in the last 18 months is really not a great deal of engagement at a detailed level by the occupier when choosing their building in respect of the environmental aspects. It has been there, but it hasn't been at the same level of attention that the landlords, the developers and others have given this. And really they've given that as a result of pressure from their investors. So you can see that in the last 18 months, there has been a growing pressure from investors to ensure that their money is invested in a environmental, social and governance controlled way. And large group of UK and world investors in real estate have worked really hard to come up with and ensure that their property development of the future is on that pathway to a net neutral carbon position. And I suppose it was just the perspective that in my view is ahead of occupier thinking. Not that occupiers in their core business aren't thinking very carefully about ESG, but they're doing that from their core business perspective, not necessarily linking it through to their occupied premises and their real estate decisions. And I think this it brought out from a survey that one of the big agents has recently just published, which, when they asked their real estate client in-house, what do you see as the most important thing strategically that you support within the business? And you can find this online, but staggeringly, the least important that they saw themselves supporting currently was ESG. It was about brand quality. It was about cost reduction, employee well-being, important things. But I suppose it's just the fact that I think that is now a penny that's dropped, and we're seeing it within our client base, and that they are now going to get very attentive on this. I think the other perspective is that we've seen the statements which are what is your intent as opposed to what is your actual. And really, this is now the next move in respect of property development, and most crucially, the operation of these buildings, how they operate long term. And I think it would just be useful, within the context of ESG, we've seen a number of the big landlords go and get behind and set up NABERS, and I'll just spell that. It's NABERS. It's something that's been adopted in Australia and New Zealand for the last 10, 15 years, and is really a basis of assessing and star rating your design and your buildings. Now, the great and good, Legal and General, Aviva, Landsec, British Land, Crown Estate, GPE, they've all got behind NABERS UK in the last 12 months. They've created this, they've adopted it, they're establishing it as part of their design principles. But the next stage of that is to ensure that the NABERS assessment of the tenancy and the building and occupation is running a real-time data on the building's environmental operation impact. Now, they haven't gone to that commitment to run all their buildings in that way, and I suppose it's just a call out for ultimately the customer and the paying party, the person who creates and enjoys their occupation here, the tenant, to ensure that all landlords, owners and operators of buildings are able to show them their environmental footprint of occupation of the building. And I just think that that's going to be an ever increasing part of the tenant decision. Now, I think undoubtedly cost is always there, and we see this being talked about all day long, which is, environmental decisions cost you. And so possibly with some hybrid working, you will start to see more appetite and more cost allocated to some environmental decisions by occupiers. I think importantly also, you don't want to be an occupier left in that two-tier market. And this is the two-tier market that the landlord investors see, primarily that they've got buildings that aren't 4, 5, 6-star rated, that buildings are falling below, that won't operate at the required levels. Now, if you're a tenant in occupation of that, look after your service charge, look where it's going. How soon do you want to get out? So, I think these are the dynamics that I can see being important parts of the equation of stay versus go for tenants now and going forward.
Thanks, Richard. And I know that we've had this discussion in the past around this sense of this bifurcation of the market between those sort of at the top end, the buildings that are responding to that sort of ESG agenda, but equally, of course, the sense then of adaptive reuse of buildings. Yeah. Potentially the most sustainable way of using a building, which is to use it again, rather than just letting it go to something new. So I know, and maybe that's something that we can touch upon another time. Acutely aware of our time going through here, there's probably a whole conversation to be had on that. Okay, well, look, thanks both. I know that one thing I was just going to touch on briefly when was about the something I was picking up on Property Week, which was around this in the city, the sort of office to resi, the permitted development rights that are creeping in there. The sense that the planning committee being urged to extend the exemption on that. I was just intrigued, very briefly, whether you had any thoughts on that.
Well, I think that the city own a lot of real estate themselves. It'll be interesting to see whether they lead by example on it as opposed to just by policy. I think there's in part an asset valuation gap potentially between some of these assets, and really, you're right. There are sensible residential conversion office buildings and other metropolitan buildings that would be well placed to go that direction. Really, the equation is, are the residential prices strong enough to support the conversion, and is the existing valuation of the asset poor enough to go across the pond? But I think hopefully we will see that, and I think these cities are going to need a greater diverse sense of occupants, which is going to include homes strongly, in order that they become attractive and survive. So I can see the policy. I just how clearly the city going to lead on it is the question, I think.
It is. It's going to be an interesting one. I know that we'll touch upon this a little bit later on. Hence the reason for raising it now, just that it perhaps gets into the mind of some of our attendees today. But just this sense of the 15-minute city. What does that look like? This sense of potential moving from commercial to resi. What does that start to look like in this whole essence of hybrid working? Of course, we're just touching a little bit on the office, but it's going to have a potentially big impact across the city. Okay, so thanks very much indeed for the two of you for that update from last year. That's fantastic to get a sense of what's continuing to happen in the early part of this year. So right now, we're not going to be having our second poll. Well, again, little technical glitch going on there. So right now, I think we'll turn to the legal perspective and a bit of an overview from Ramato and Faye. And Ramato, I think you're starting us off here, if I'm correct.
Yes, no, absolutely. Thanks, Tim. Just a very quick introduction. For those of you who joined the property session last November, which Lee's already mentioned, you'll recall that we talked about the legal remedies available to landlords and tenants. And we also spoke a little about our experiences of advising clients at the time. Today, Faye's going to let you have a brief update on the legal position and what's potentially on the horizon. So over to you, Faye.
Thanks, Ramato. For the past year, we've seen the government intervene in the functioning of the property market by legislatively bubble wrapping tenants. Whilst we're hopefully now in the last phase of the pandemic, the implications of lockdown for the commercial property market will only fully be revealed as the government restrictions are released. So in the coming months, remedies for and enforcement of breaches of leases are going to become increasingly topical. So where are we now? The Coronavirus Act brought the first of the legislative changes, and forfeiture is a landlord's right to terminate a lease during the term. The Act imposed a suspension on forfeiture for non-payment of rent. This suspension has been extended by the government on 3 occasions, but is now due to expire on the 30th of June. In June 2020, the government introduced the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act, which placed a restriction on winding up petitions by landlords where a tenant couldn't pay its rent due to COVID. Again, these restrictions are due to expire on the 30th of June. And the restrictions on landlords using commercial rent arrears recovery, or CRAR, which is the modern form of distress, are also due to expire on the same date. On the 19th of June, the government published a code of practice, which was intended to promote good practice amongst landlords and tenants during the pandemic. The code was updated in April, and the update introduced a template to assist landlords and tenants in negotiations in relation to rent arrears and ongoing lease terms. Key features include tenants disclosing financial information to help landlords make an assessment of their financial position. Tenants making offers to settle based on what they can afford and proposing payment plans, and landlords responding by reference to their own financial position and making counter offers. Because the template's so new, it's difficult to say if it's having any impact in practice. But throughout the pandemic, we have seen the code being used by tenants to prompt landlords to negotiate, and by landlords to require tenants to divulge financial information. The biggest criticism of the code remains that it's voluntary, so not enforceable. However, the update makes clear that parties are encouraged to use the code to negotiate a settlement, and court remains very much the last resort. And whilst the code is intended to stay in place until the 24th of June, it's doubtful that we've seen its last iteration. If I could have the next slide, please. Whilst it was widely understood that the moratoriums had been extended for the last time, the government's announcement on the 6th of April of a call for evidence indicates it may not be the end of the restrictions. The purpose of the call for evidence is to support the government's decision-making on the best way to withdraw or replace the moratoriums by gathering evidence to understand how landlords and tenants are responding to the pandemic. At this stage, the focus is only on forfeiture and CRAR, so tenant CVAs or restrictions on winding up petitions are not covered, but the government is interested in whether those measures should remain or not. The consultation puts forward 6 options to operate from the 1st of July, and those options are set out on the slide and include allowing the existing measures to expire on the 30th of June, allowing the forfeiture moratorium to expire but retaining the other moratoriums, restricting the protections to particular businesses based on the impact of COVID-19, and views on which industries should benefit are being sought, encouraging formal mediation or otherwise non-binding adjudication and binding non-judicial adjudication. The consultation closed on 4th of May, so it remains to be seen what comes out of it. However, alongside the consultation, the government has also announced a review of the commercial landlord and tenant relationship, and that review is intended to make recommendations on how to ensure a flexible and fit for purpose legislative framework that enables sustainable occupation of high streets and town centres in the future. And it's designed to consider a broad range of issues, including reform of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1954. If I could have the next slide. The moratoriums have significantly limited a landlord's options for recovering rent. However, the outcome of 2 recent court cases means that landlords are now breathing a collective sigh of relief. The first case concerned a landlord's claim to recover rent arrears from TFS stores, which is a perfume retailer based in Westfield. The tenant advanced 3 defences. Firstly, that the claim was premature given the code of practice. Secondly, that pursuing a debt claim was contrary to the government's restrictions. And thirdly, that the rent suspension clause in the lease was triggered. The court dismissed all of the arguments and said that the code of practice doesn't alter the legal landlord and tenant relationship, and it is not a charter for tenants not to pay rent. The government's restrictions did not restrict a landlord's ability to pursue a debt, and the rent suspension clause did not apply as there was no physical damage to the property. The second case involved a landlord's claim for unpaid rent due from a number of tenants, including Sports Direct and Cineworld. The tenants did put forward similar arguments, relying on the code of practice, the triggering of the rent suspension clause, and also advancing a case for the closures amounting to a temporary or permanent frustration of the leases. However, again, the court dismissed all of the arguments, finding that the rent suspension clause required physical damage, which prevented occupation. The code of practice was a voluntary scheme and wasn't relevant to cases where the tenants weren't saying that they couldn't pay rent, and none of the lockdown measures triggered any legal frustration of the leases, temporary or otherwise. There are rumours of an appeal in the Bank of New York Mellon case, so the tenants' arguments may yet be revisited. However, given the household names involved, we can assume that every single available argument that might be put forward for non-payment of rent was deployed. And whilst the courts were sympathetic to the tenants, it was made pretty clear that if there were to be special provisions for tenants who hadn't been able to trade, then that was for Parliament to legislate for, and not the job of the courts. So following these judgments, landlords might expect to see more engagement from tenants who have sought to run similar arguments, and particularly those tenants who can pay rent but have chosen not to do so. But the impact of these decisions will obviously need to be considered in the context of the outcome of the consultation, given that some of the measures could change the legal landscape significantly. Lots to think and talk about, Tim.
Indeed, thanks, Faye. And I suspect there's going to be a lot of people, quite literally watching the space over what's going to be happening over the next few months with some of those court decisions and otherwise. So it's thanks ever so much for providing us with a little bit of details to what we have so far. But as you rightly point out, that's going to be a bit of an ongoing one as we kind of work our way through the process on this. So thanks indeed to Ramata and Faye for that quick update, what's happening from the legal perspective. One of the things I was just wanting to, I'm going to stop sharing at this point because we don't need to look at that slide right now. There we go, that's a bit better, isn't it? People can actually get to see each other a little bit more. So just on the back of the elements that we were talking through there, just a quick, I guess, few questions that we can discuss as a panel before moving on to Q&A. But is that sense of the first one, I suppose, has that sort of broader theme, picking up on the conversation that we were just having there around slightly broader perspective. But with that moratorium on forfeiting leases coming to the end at the end of June, what do we think are the risks, the potential risk to tenants and therefore for potential landlord actions, and how do we think the government might respond to that? And I think probably best to go to perhaps Ramatu. Would you want to have a quick response on that one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think in terms of risk to tenants, it really varies according to sector. So we act for landlords and tenants. I'm mainly on the tenant side, and we also act for clients across sectors. clearly the pandemic has been very difficult for our hotel and leisure clients, and they're facing real challenges in reopening and gearing up. Many of them laid off staff, as although there was furlough, you may remember that on occasion it wasn't extended till quite late in the day, by which time some operators had to make difficult decisions and basically had let go of staff. In some cases as well, staff were from Europe. So I have been hearing amongst some clients that with the combination of the pandemic and Brexit, some staff simply went home. And they're either struggling to return or unwilling to come back at the present time. So for clients in hospitality, I think in particular there are real issues, and also obviously speaking very generally, those will be the sectors where there are significant arrears of rent and service charge, plus they're now having to restock and spend money to reopen, not necessarily knowing what trade will be like and what landlords are going to do.
Yeah, there's been quite a bit in the press about the sense of trying to get hold of staff for the hospitality sector, with people deciding to perhaps not spend so much of their time in the UK. So
yeah, no,
that's
no,
definitely
absolutely.
a hot topic, I think.
No, definitely. I mean, and I think also for some sectors such as hospitality, and also I think non-essential retail, those are the ones where they will have had to have made arrangements with landlords if they've been able. And I think the thing to remember there is that most of the arrangements have involved a rent deferral as opposed to the rent being actually written off. So they're going to, I think, basically be pretty worried. For non-essential retail, you know, they've got other issues. Are they ever going to get back to the high street? Is the future online? So I think there are real issues there.
It's a whole other debate, yes, quite.
No, absolutely.
As somebody who spends a large chunk of time on the online shopping. But anyway, enough of me on that one. Richard Lee, any comment from you on that one?
Well, I suppose in terms of the moratorium, in terms of our sector offices and most of our clients, to be honest, their businesses have continued to be able to operate. They've continued to pay their rents. And I don't think it's had the same impact or had the same protection for office occupiers largely. I think one thing that did happen as a result of the pandemic is that some office occupiers rang up and said, I'm in a bit of a panic. Do you know what? I'd like to suspend or I'd like to defer. And some of those conversations actually resulted in re-geared leases. So there was often an opportunity. And I know a lot of landlords at the time were taking the opportunity to actually look at extending leases out for tenants in return for some suspension today. So I think broadly, the Act hasn't covered most of the office tenants that we're aware of, and if you look at office rents nationally, I think it's into the 80% of it's paid compared to 20% on the retail and hospitality level. So you can just see where the impact has fallen, and it hasn't had the same cover for the tenants of offices, which you can understand.
Indeed, it seems to be that sort of 80-20 split that's creeping in there. Okay, so some useful insights around that part. Let's, with our time ticking on, let's take a quick look into the future. So dusting off the crystal ball at this point, which seems to be looking as cloudy as ever. But let's see if we can get some degree of clarity through to it. So when we're thinking about the likely ongoing impact of the last 12 months or so, what are our thoughts that sort of come around on that? I suppose, Richard, do you want to perhaps start off with that?
Sorry, Tim, in terms of the sort of the thoughts as to what we think is now going to unfold.
Yeah, that sort of view into the future, thinking through from what the last 12 months has told us, what do you think is the likely ongoing impact of that?
Well, I think what we see from an office sector basis is businesses believe they can operate successfully and profitably with less office space. That's the broad trend we're seeing. People are saying, I can do this with less. Now, how that really plays out, and I think it depends on what sector of businesses they are. We've got finance teams who are quite happy to remotely work and look like they're going to do so forever in some cases. Now, whether that's a firm of accountants making that decision or whether that's an in-house finance team of a creative ad agency. Clearly, the creative ad agency want to get together and be creative and need to do so. And they've got no intention of not being in the office. They have to be in a creative space to do their job. So I think we're seeing it depending, it's complex. We've also got people saying, I haven't even turned back up yet, so don't ask me about it.
Yes.
And I think your timeline shows that quite interestingly. We've got a heap of tenants who are saying, or clients who are saying, okay, look, we're going to be back in properly end of summer, and we're going to see how that works, and we're not going to make any decisions.
Yes.
I think it's only when your event occurs. So if you've had a lease event that has occurred in the last 12 months or is likely to occur in the next 6 to 12 months, you've had to accelerate your thinking, possibly, and you don't know whether that's going to play out correctly yet.
And how can you? And I think this is the point. So certainly, we're having this conversation a lot with clients right now, that unless there is there's a particular urgent event, somebody's event that's coming up, around which you have to make a decision right now based on what information you've got, then there's a need that's driven by that. Otherwise, try and have that sort of test and learn throughout 2021 that will just give you a little bit more insight into what can be coming up next year, because as we keep saying, we don't know. Lots of sort of prophetic statements coming out online, but maybe they are just more around that at the moment. So Ramatu, Faye, anything from your perspective on that? What have we learned for the last 12 months that we think might be impacting again into the future?
Yeah, so just very quickly kick off. I think from a lease perspective, existing clients are, I think, trying to sublet where they can and reduce their space requirements, but not necessarily giving up everything, and are looking at to exercise breaks where they can. But we are still actually dealing with new leases. They're tending to be shorter term, with clients wanting more breaks. There's a big call for these so-called pandemic clauses, but they really aren't very popular with landlords or banks. So we try, but don't necessarily succeed. And there's one point, and I did notice actually a comment in the chat. One thing that we've noticed is particularly for offices and for overseas clients, where they don't have a huge footprint in the UK at present, they're tending to want to move away from having sort of independent office leases, and they're tending to move towards serviced offices, actually, just for the short term. So if they've actually got lease events coming up, so one lease will end, instead of actually looking for new premises now for a longer term, they're actually just kind of going somewhere, I think, to ride out the storm and just see what's going to happen. There's also, I would say, as there is from time to time, a big call for leases to be shorter, and I mean physically shorter, and for the whole lease process to be short-circuited and made cheaper. This can be done, but I think, as Faye mentioned earlier, there's a long history of freedom to contract and make your own bargain, which does tend to lead to leases having everything in them, including the kitchen sink. So things can be done, but we'll have to see. I don't know if Faye had anything to add.
Just one very quick point, which is that obviously the pandemic's hit both landlords and tenants financially. So for landlords, we are seeing a renewed focus on security required from a tenant when granting a lease, particularly given that the restrictions have obviously limited a landlord's remedies for recovering rent. So it might be in the future that landlords are asking for a significantly higher rent deposit as security. And for the tenant, this has meant a slight turning of the tables, and probably an unprecedented need to consider a landlord's covenant strength, particularly in the context of some of the more flexible types of lease or license that we're now seeing in the market.
I think that whole sense of the use of flexible space and the demand on the lease times and the lease breaks is going to be it's going to be a debate coming up over the next few years, isn't it? Let's be honest about it, because there's a sense, and I can see Jenny writing in the chat there around a view of more and more organisations want to be able to have that flexibility built into a lease, but inevitably that's going to drive up some costs around the real estate. But we'll perhaps touch upon that in a few minutes, but I'll keep on working our way through. We want to try and cover a little bit around that hybrid working element. We wanted to just talk a little bit through on that one. We touched upon it at the outset. Certainly, I think from our perspective, just a couple of points around that element of hybrid working before coming back out to you, which is that sense of, from our perspective, hybrid working is not new. We were working from home and office and others before the pandemic. We can remember the average use of office space was only around 50% anyway, so not exactly full, not exactly the sense of only working from two locations, and we had the kind of the fall off Friday. So let's not see this as new, but rather that it's as with a number of aspects with the pandemic, it's been an acceleration of some existing trends. I think it's worthwhile just reminding ourselves that therefore it's not a new thing. Much of what we're seeing reported back is this sort of 2 to 3 day split, sometimes different between the employee and the employer over where those 2 and 3 days sit, whether home or the office or elsewhere. So I think we need to experiment and explore where that is going to land. And so the engagement and the testing around that is key. Hence the reason why we referenced that at the start point. We're seeing a lot of that sort of prophetic announcement in the press. It's definitely X or it's definitely Y. Understandably, it's a very business-centered approach around, dare want to say, a bit of command and control creeping in there. Once I've made the decision, it will be true, and therefore I can now plan. Not sure that as human beings we'll respond quite so sheep-like with that, but we'll see what happens. Let's plan and see how that pattern is starting to take place over the next sort of 6 months or so, and I think that's going to be an important part. Managing the peak times. We know that Tuesday and Thursday is most likely going to be the most popular times for being in the office if we work on some of those pre-pandemic aspects. So let's try and understand how we manage those peak times. It's going to be crucial. Talking through with teams is probably going to be the best way of doing that. Teams and people that work in the office, they are human. They do understand the pressures. So actually we can have a transparent and open conversation with them. And I think last point from me on that one is then just making sure that hybrid working, if that's where we are heading and that's what we're going to call it, let's make sure that it does become exactly that and not just a wider example of what working from home was or working from different locations was like before. I think, for example, of the video calling that we've got going on right now, we've got used to this sort of very democratic approach of each of us on our little screen, but I'm sure some of you have experienced it. I know I have already, where some people are in an office and if you're at home, it's amazing how we can easily start to slip back into some of those old habits of almost forgetting the person who is there, kind of zooming in, and the meeting is really taking place in the meeting room. So I think it's making sure that we don't slip back into some of those habits, because that doesn't suit any of us when we're the ones who are outside of the office. It's very easy to do that. So we need to work hard in embedding some of those changes if we'd like them to continue, and making sure that we kind of lead by example on it. So just a few thoughts from me and from us around the sort of the hybrid working, but any thoughts from, and I'm going to just open that one up now to the four of you. Any thoughts that came in on the hybrid working?
I mean, one thing that interests me, Tim, is just everything that's happening in the service office world. I suppose it touches on the question that's come through on the chat as well, with what clients are doing. We're seeing more and more clients, particularly portfolio clients, if they've got small satellite offices, move into more flexible arrangements with service office operators. And it just gives them flexibility of term. They can grow and retract in size if they need to and be much more reactive. There's also been some interesting stuff in the press about IWG and other operators signing up very big contracts with certain occupiers. So I think it was Standard Chartered who've got access for 95,000 staff globally to touch in and out of IWG offices. NTT in Japan has about 300,000 employees, has the same rights. So these big overarching contracts with large corporate occupiers is becoming more and more common. But I suppose what's interesting is, through COVID, the flexible office operators struggled quite a lot, because obviously they charge a premium for flexibility. But one of the difficulties is if people are under stress and need to get out of these contracts, they can do so fairly easily. So what we saw were occupancy rates in many service office operators plummet. And as a result of that, quite a few of them are under financial stress. So we've seen IWG, one of the subsidiaries in the US, file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. And it's an interesting one because going forwards, I suppose, you know, typically with property, it's usually landlords who are covenant checking tenants, but at the moment, it's very much, you know, a tenant's responsibility as well to try and covenant check the landlord or the operator. And,
I know that you said, sorry, I was going to say, I know that you said also there has been some introduction of dark charges that you'd mentioned in some of our last conversations.
Yeah, so with service office operators 10 years ago, I think a lot of the operators were notorious for not being completely upfront about what they were charging and how they were charging it. So typically when you look at a service office, there's a desk rate that's marketed £500 per person per desk. But 10 years ago, you know, you'd be adding things like IT, you'd be adding cleaning maybe, coffees. There are all these sort of charges that made it incredibly difficult to know what you're actually signing up for. And what happened was because of the competition in the markets, particularly in London, the whole industry grew up a lot and the pricing models became really simplified. So tenants acquiring space knew what they were signing up for, they knew what they were paying, and you could compare different operators sort of in a balanced way. But what we've seen in the last 6 months is probably because of the financial stress that some of these operators are going through, they are sort of creeping back some of these strange charges. So we've had an instance with one client where they signed up to an office, and with service offices, you know, cleaning would be something that would be included. In this particular centre, they would only clear the bins now if they're at least half full. And the cleaning would only apply to the floor, but not the desks. So if you wanted your desk cleaned, you'd have to pay more. There's also another operator that started to charge £20 per person per month for coffee. That was something that's been included in most operators' pricing structures for a long time now. So it's a bit disappointing that it's going that way.
A little bit. Let's hope the coffee's good. In which case, if it's going to be charging separately for it. We could be chatting about that for a bit longer, I've no doubt. We've got a couple of minutes left, and I want to try and cover off just a couple of quick questions that have come in. Well, the questions may not be quick, but let's see if we can get some quick responses from our panel here. So we're going to be looking for brief responses, if I may. So firstly, do the panel think that there are any key milestones or things that need to happen for occupiers to be making key property decisions? So any sort of insights that you can be providing there for sort of the big milestones for occupiers to be making key property decisions?
I think just kicking off from a legal perspective, I mean, and obviously it does depend sector to sector, but as Faye was saying, just picking up on, you know, we are expecting a government announcement. There's also intended to be a rates review at some point, and obviously we all know that you know, rates have a significant impact and are very high. So I think there are a couple of events coming up which may impact how people decide to take things forward. You know, and also, of course, whether or not when we completely go back after the 21st of June, if there's another resurgence, another lockdown.
Indeed. I think there'll be another one. Okay, moving on to another quick one. So that's a quick one answer, thank you. So this one is a question asking, further to Richard about city centres, are we actually seeing any signs of people choosing to relocate out of London into local hubs?
So the answer to that is we are seeing people running the slide rule over it. It's always occurred. It's always been about, do we all have to be here together in this expensive city office? I think there will be people who, you know, to some extent, the hybrid, the working from home has almost removed the need for the finance centre to sit somewhere outside the M25 or somewhere regionally. You know, I think there's almost a move to, do you need that office? And then you're into some touchdown space, you're into what Lee mentioned about, you know, some regional hubs, or ultimately people getting together and saying, you know, we're going to go and use the collab space in central London and we're meeting, you know, once a fortnight to do that. So I think the sort of journey to go out of London and move teams and HR as part of that, I think you've seen some bigger decisions that some of the bigger corporates have made almost alongside the levelling up agenda, you know, sort of Goldman Sachs,
yeah,
they go to Birmingham. The lawyers have been practicing it for some time, whether that's Northern Ireland, Manchester, Birmingham. I was in Newcastle yesterday, and my goodness, there's a great deal of quality office space up there, all for £25 a foot or less, comparable to London space. And So there are, the answer is it is, but it's not just about getting outside the M25. I think it's about a UK-wide agenda.
Interesting, thank you. And it's obviously other UK cities are available.
Yeah, not only anyway.
Not just you guys. Well, look, we've got more questions, but we've run out of time. So big apologies. We'll see if we can get some answers out on some of those questions that have come in. But we must draw ourselves to a close at this point. I hope the conversation today has helped to frame further conversations on the future of work and how we draw together those key infrastructure aspects that enable us to do what we do, the physical, virtual, and the human. But firstly, can I pass on our very grateful thanks to our guest speakers today, Richard, Lee, Ramatu, and Faye. Once again, you've shown us the sheer breadth and depth and scale of your insight. Thank you, we do appreciate it. Grateful thanks to the ABLE team behind the scenes. So thank you very much. Thank you also to all of you who've attended the discussion today and for raising the debate and posing some great questions there. We could have been on for a lot longer. We'll be running some more sessions in the near future, so please do keep a lookout for those. But otherwise, I leave you to get out and vote for anybody who hasn't yet done so. So please go and do that. Many thanks for your time today and have a great evening. Thanks, everybody, and goodbye.